We spend a lot of time on this podcast discussing the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. But today I want to take a necessary step back to look at a much larger story that's at play here. One of corporate power, political ideology, massive investments, and fundamental questions about who actually gets to shape the future of psychedelic medicine. This is the integration session where we explore the science stories and future of psychedelic science. I'm Elena, and today we are joined by authors of the recent book, Psychedelic Capitalism. Kevin Walby is a professor of criminal justice at the University of Winnipeg, and Jamie Brownlee teaches Canadian and international political economy at Carleton University. In this conversation, Kevin and Jamie pull back the curtain on the rapid commercialization of psychedelics, answering my tough questions about how private capital is reshaping the field, the risks of corporate capture, the broken patent system, and whether the current Western medical model is really suited for substances with deep spiritual and social dimensions. We also explore the uncomfortable intersections with far-right movements, transhumanist visions, and the hyper-individualistic wellness industry, as well as the potential for expanded surveillance in a regulated psychedelic market. But it's not all doom and gloom. We also discuss more hopeful paths forward and how psychedelics could be used responsibly as tools for social change. Let's dive in. Hello, Kevin and Jamie. Welcome to the Integration Session podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of supporting your local library, so I know that your book was published last year, but I actually only got a chance to read it in January. But it was well worth the wait, so I'm really looking forward to speaking more about it with you today. My first question is just, why did you want to write this book? And at what point did you kind of discover that there's more to this story of psychedelics than just the hyped headlines that we see in the media?
Yeah, well, we've been, both of us, I think I can speak for both of us on this point, have been interested in psychedelics at a personal level for quite a while. I personally had some pretty meaningful experiences as a young adult with psychedelics that actually had a lasting impact on me. And we've also sort of dabbled in psychedelics at an intellectual and a historical level as well. So, when psychedelics sort of hit the mainstream several years ago, we were initially quite excited. Maybe the so-called psychedelic renaissance could, be a positive force for humanity and for society. That excitement, though, that hope, that optimism faded pretty quickly when we, examined the media hype around psychedelics, the various actors that were coming to sort of own and occupy this space, the drug policies that were likely to inform and direct this movement. We came to a very different conclusion, I would say. And I guess part of the motivation to write the book was that very few people were talking about the kind of issues that concerned us: inequality, power, control, commodification, the appropriation of indigenous knowledge, and how all of this might impact the broader, war on drugs. So within the mainstream, at least, there was really silence on these issues. So that was a gap that we felt we maybe could try to address. I don't know how well we did, but we gave it a shot. And as social science researchers who have studied things like corporate capture and other domains, we thought maybe we were in a good position to give it a go.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of topics that aren't really talked about in the psychedelic community. There is this focus on the therapeutic potential, but I do think it's important to bring up those points about the social implications, and the economic aspects as well. Kevin, was it a similar motivation for you?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that Jamie has studied Canadian political economy and global political economy for a long time, and I've studied social control and surveillance for a long time. And those issues are also really central to investigating psychedelic capitalism today.
Yeah, and we'll get into those because I definitely want to pick your brain on what those issues are and why it's concerning, and then eventually what are some alternatives. So getting into why you named this book Psychedelic Capitalism, I know that our listeners have a lot of interest from the clinical and therapeutic aspects, like I said, but why are psychedelics of interest from a financial perspective, and who in particular is interested in capitalizing on psychedelics?
Well, I think a lot of people believe that we're certainly told that psychedelics may revolutionize mental health care, right? That's a very common narrative, offer more effective treatments for particular conditions. And, a crucial part of this, I think, maybe to mention right off the bat, is the race to capture intellectual property, associated with this to secure new and put legal barriers around new compounds, existing compounds. That's where the real money could be made in the future. It's kind of, we don't know yet, but especially if that leads to the creation of market monopolies, which we see in the broader drug industry, all the time. And who stands to benefit from this? It's pretty simple. The entrepreneurs and the venture capitalists, the corporate financiers, and the companies who are looking to cash in on this movement, right? On the psychedelic renaissance. Who's not benefiting? I would say, underground practitioners and researchers, people who kept this movement alive during Prohibition and who, produced vast repositories of knowledge around these substances, which are now being used by the industry. Not most Indigenous communities who've really done the same thing over generations. That knowledge is being appropriated and commodified, and not the general public either. So there are very specific groups that stand to benefit and groups that don't. I would just say, much like other industries, other capitalist industries, the foundations of psychedelic capitalism, of the psychedelic industry, were created largely by the public, at the public's expense, and are now being handed over to private capital in a very typical fashion.
And could you just lay a bit of the foundation for our listeners as to this economic landscape? So, the rise of different IP and companies and large corporations. What does that sort of look like, and how is that similar to cannabis maybe a couple years ago?
Well, I think Jamie will say a little bit more about this, but people might be surprised to learn that there is like a big cannabis or a cannabis industry in Canada. There are some of the same market tendencies in the cannabis space as are in other financial and economic sectors. So you have these tendencies towards monopolization. You have bigger firms that have less interest in catering to the needs of people, taking over more and more of the little players, and eventually they end up resembling like big tobacco, big pharma, big alcohol, big agra. And so the cannabis space right now, there's a lot of big players that are actually owned by other players in uh, far-flung sectors that might seemingly have nothing to do with cannabis and the therapeutic potential of cannabis. And in the psychedelic space, there's that kind of tendency happening already.
Yeah, you might call it I think we say in the book, an unhealthy relationship with profit and investment. Both of these spheres. So in Canada, or in cannabis, in both Canada and the United States, you see, the small players who were pushing for criminal justice reform, the small dispensary owners who were risking their freedom during Prohibition to push for criminal justice reform. They're now lamenting legalization because they just totally swallowed up and dominated by the big, corporate players who are dominating the system. We call it cannabis capitalism. Very similar processes that work with psychedelics today.
And in your book, you describe the patent system as broken. So, can you explain a bit about what you mean by that and the consequences?
Yeah, we point to many pretty glaring problems with the patent system, and if you take them together, it really shows the markers of a broken system. So patents tend to hinder research and development. When confronted with a bunch of patents in a given field, startup companies, inventors, researchers, they tend to scale back their research and development initiatives. They also maybe even don't even enter the field, are dissuaded from entering the field altogether. And the drug industry in particular is just rife with, anti-competitive patents that they're hindering, innovation. This is happening with psychedelics now. We looked at some of the data, and the number of patent applications at psychedelics, it's growing, and it's growing exponentially, I would say, over the last decade or so. Similarly, another big problem is drug pricing, which is, may come to may come soon to psychedelics too. I mean, patents are often used to, as I said, reduce competition, obtain market exclusivity, which can result in extremely high prices. In the drug industry, monopolies go hand in hand with price gouging. And generally, the system too, it just more generally increases social and economic inequality in society. I think we cite a stat in the book that says, from 2000 to 2018, 35 drug companies made 9 trillion in gross profits. And you may say, well, that's just because they're producing innovative, great new drugs. No, that's not the main reason. The main reason is patents and the monopolies that intellectual property allows them to, obtain. So, as psychedelics enter the world of patenting at scale for the first time, we expect that the same kind of problems and injustices that I just described are going to be replicated here.
And it's a pretty interesting space just all on its own. Like you've got these big companies with ties to major global capitalists like Compass Pathways, and they're maybe one of the worst offenders putting in these so-called bad patents, and they're trying to patent
Yeah.
things like the color of the room or the texture of the couch, where you would take their proprietary psilocybin. And then on the other hand, you've got these groups like Porta Sofia that will challenge these companies and say, hang on a minute, you can't patent that. And they use this idea of prior art. So they'll say, no, this has been prominent in culture or prominent in use before, so you can't put a patent on it. And it's a really interesting space to see these kinds of knowledge battles over what can be patented, what shouldn't be. But ultimately, that is a tool that these companies are using to try to enclose the
The
psychedelic
psychedelic
movement.
commons, yeah.
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 Yeah, and there's this term psychedelic exceptionalism, or the idea that psychedelics are sort of immune to this capitalist co-optation. So, what is your take on that, and how might that perpetuate these risks as well?
Well, that's just not true, right? That's a very prominent idea. The idea that psychedelics are somehow immune to corporate capture or capitalist co-optation. And this is something we encountered actually time and time again during the course of our research. Exactly that idea that psychedelics are going to be, the industry is going to be fundamentally different. Why? Because, ethics supposedly trump profits in this industry, because the field was founded by true believers, so to speak, that are advocates, and they're not just in it to make money, or that the compounds themselves, when taken by executives, lead these executives almost automatically to become open-hearted and benevolent, and not kind of the antithesis of your typical capitalist. There's no evidence for any of that. It's a very common claim, but where's the evidence? Uh, and why would there be? The ways that for-profit companies operate in virtually every other industry we know has way more to do with the structural imperatives of the institutions and the broader system in which they operate than it does with the people who run them, no matter what their values or commitments or intentions are. And you can see this right now in debates over drug policy reform, where most psychedelic capitalists are dead set against decriminalization or other models of legalization that might conflict with their bottom line. So yeah, in no way are psychedelics immune to capitalist co-optation or corporate capture, and to believe they are is in many ways perpetuating the risks a lot of the risks that we address in the book.
Another part of the psychedelic exceptionalism term that we critique in the book has to do with broader politics regarding drugs and harm reduction. So, like Jamie was saying, these capitalist folks interested in psychedelics, they are often also making claims for tighter regulations, more punitive drug laws, and our argument is we should be interested in safe access to these substances, but psychedelics are not in a special category. They're also possibly harmful at times, and we should think about drugs and consciousness modifying substances in terms of a broader politics, and that includes a critique of the war on drugs. So we have lots of parts in the book where we critique this idea of psychedelic exceptionalism when it's leading to sometimes demonization of other people who use drugs. And we draw inspiration from groups like Drug User Liberation Front and other harm reduction groups that are calling for more rational adult drug policy in Canada and beyond.
Yeah, there's so many paradoxes at play that you nicely highlight in the book. And getting more into psychedelics and different ideologies, you talk a bit about how psychedelics have been implicated with different political ideologies like the far right movements. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was a fun chapter to write, I have to say, because there's just so much bizarre information out there. I mean, I would start by saying that psychedelics are, many of your listeners might know, highly context dependent in terms of their effects. They've been famously described as non-specific amplifiers that tend to mirror or magnify particular states of mind rather than, inducing certain states of consciousness on a specific basis. You know, Related to that, they're heavily dependent on set and setting, which is another very common term in psychedelia, which includes, the personality expectations of the user as well as the social, political, and cultural environments within which the experiences take place. So, it follows that any shifts in political beliefs or ideologies are largely contextual when it involves psychedelics. It's not simply psychedelics, made someone this or that or the other thing. And one of the things we felt compelled to push back on in the book are these just remarkably grandiose political claims by many advocates that, psychedelics necessarily lead to more altruistic individuals, a more progressive society, or even that psychedelics are going to save the world in some fashion, right? Reduce political polarization and, usher in world peace and all of this kind of stuff. If only we could get Trump to trip, everything would be fine, right? And I don't want to go too far. I mean, there's no doubt that psychedelics can have significant impacts on individuals in terms of, political impacts. Look at the 1960s, they infused the organizing efforts of a lot of groups back then. We go through examples in the book of individuals who were radicalized, largely through psychedelic use in the right contexts. But history also shows it being used by conservatives and reactionaries throughout history, including far-right groups in the past and far-right groups today. So under some circumstances, psychedelics can play a role maybe in turning people toward progressive movements and challenging power structures. Yeah, but in other contexts, they can do exactly the opposite, turn people towards far-right groups and, right-wing conspiracy theories. So we shouldn't pretend that there's any essentialist outcomes here. And, to do so is really just playing into the hands of people who, say we allow us to do everything we want with psychedelics because they're ultimately going to save the world. So don't interfere with our movement. Right?
We also found some pretty curious connections between psychedelics and like the military-industrial complex in the United States, which were pretty alarming to us. Like you've got the U.S. military and other militaries around the world interested in groups like MAPS because they want to dose their soldiers immediately upon returning back from war so they don't sustain some kind of mental injury, and you've got police associations saying the same thing. But that doesn't really address the bigger problems with the military-industrial complex, war, imperialism, policing. It just is an attempt to address the trauma or the harm that those people experience from harming other people. You've got people like Rick Perry, former governor of Texas, who's a big advocate, and you've got people who are close to Trump's inner circle who are big advocates.
Yeah, Republican Party as a whole. Yeah.
And they're pushing the psychedelic industry. They're pushing for access, but not for everyone. Mostly for certain categories of people, mostly soldiers. And we critique that tendency because our argument is if there is a benefit to psychedelics, it should be provided to everyone accessibly, affordably, and not just as part of some kind of like military industrial niche.
Definitely. And you talk a bit about some other sort of circles like using psychedelics for human enhancement or transhumanist motivations, or the hyper-individualistic wellness industry. So can you speak a bit more about that too and how that might be connected to like neoliberalism?
Yeah. Maybe say a few words about psychedelics and the corporate wellness industry. Some interesting connections. Corporations tend to view psychedelics, certainly in this industry, as in much the same way they view other new age health and wellness practices like yoga, uh, advanced meditation, that kind of thing. All of these things have formed the basis of what many have called the corporate wellness industry, um, or the neoliberal self-help industry, whatever you want to call it, which really emphasizes things like individualism and personal responsibility, not collective approaches to well-being, not collective approaches to changing things that might improve people's lives. It's all very individual, and psychedelics have become part of this now. Microdosing certainly, usually justified in terms of productivity and competition, these kind of things. Even psychedelic assisted therapy, it's been sort of integrated into the focus on individual self-improvement, elite perfectibility, optimization, that kind of stuff. And it's evident in the workplace too. And now, employers, especially in the United States, are giving employees as part of health and wellness packages psychedelics, often ketamine, to keep them focused on institutional goals, keep them productive, keep them well. You know, again, productivity. So, yeah, I mean, one of the key functions of this industry, we think, is to dissuade individuals from working collectively, to change the structural conditions of their lives. And again, now psychedelics are part of this, sort of tools to help people cope with or endure the structural inequalities they face rather than challenging them. I'll just give you one example. I remember a couple of years ago, I think we wrote about it in the book, Ronan Levy, who was then the CEO of Field Trip Health. He gave, a month of free ketamine sessions to fired workers in the tech industry, right? Okay, well, we think a better strategy might be to, labor organizing in the tech industry, not placating workers who've been fired, keep their heads up a little bit. So, so psychedelics are kind of being promoted within this industry as a cure for capitalism itself.
You've also got some companies that kind of mimicking the wellness industry are really focused on individual optimization. Again, a kind of distraction away from more systemic structural issues. So, just like in the wellness industry today, it's all about measuring your optimal heart rate, measuring your sweat, measuring your urine. Now these things are getting attached to psychedelics too. So
Wellness apps. Yeah.
We have a part in the book where we talk about all the different kinds of technologies that these companies are trying to hook up to people's psychedelic experiences, to measure them, to monitor them, and to quote unquote optimize. But really what it's doing is it's creating more data for surveillance capitalism to sell them more and more wellness products. And it deepens the entrenchment of this industry focus in the psychedelic space.
Yeah, and I want to talk more about medicalization and the therapeutic model because I think often we see that as the route to broader access is to push things through the Western medical framework. But a lot of people are asking, and I want to hear your thoughts on this, like, is the Western medical framework even suitable for psychedelic medicine? Because these are such unique substances with unique cultural implications. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a good question. I think maybe important to emphasize right off the bat. I mean, we do a whole chapter on medicalization, and we're quite critical, but we also don't dismiss it.
Hmm.
And maybe we haven't made this point clear enough in other talks, but we examined the clinical research pretty closely, and there's certainly promise there. There's no question about that. I mean, it sort of suggests that psychedelic assisted therapy may offer significant advantages over current drugs, current treatment regimens, right? They may even turn out to be the most effective option to deal with certain mental health conditions. So, I want to make that clear, but we also believe there are a lot of problems here too. And one question we ask is, maybe it's an obvious one, but why are psychiatrists and pharmaceutical companies and the medical establishment thought to be best suited to bring psychedelics into the mainstream? And why are their knowledge claims privileged over others? Because millions and millions of people have used psychedelics over centuries, with only a tiny sliver, tiny fraction of those people ever having done so under a Western medical model, right? With Western clinicians. So there's an incredible amount of collective knowledge out there, experience out there from centuries of indigenous use, underground use, throughout history that arguably we think does trump anything coming through the clinical realm. In fact, what's coming through the clinical realm is generally often confirming what's already well tested in those communities. So yeah, I mean, why should Western medicine sit at the top of this hierarchy of knowledge around defining safety, defining access, or as a gatekeeper of therapeutic approaches? This is an appeal to medical authority, and an authority in the area of mental health whose track record is troublesome to say the least, right?
The other aspect with medicalization is, it depends on the healthcare system. When you've got countries that have totally private healthcare systems, and the healthcare system is also driven towards corporatization, then access to psychedelics in that corporatized healthcare space is going to drive up the price. It's going to make it really expensive for people to access just one time. And we've even seen this already in places where you've got access to psychedelics, like in Australia. They legalized, and you have to go through a medical doctor. You have to use it in a medical space, and the price per dose is like, well,
Crazy.
thousands and thousands of dollars. Only really wealthy people can probably afford that. So, again, it doesn't really serve people's interests to have a medicalized model of psychedelic access. It might serve the interests of medical experts and authorities. It might serve the interests of the companies that profit from privatized, corporatized healthcare, but it doesn't really benefit the users.
Yeah, maybe a small subset of people with very acute conditions that are desperate for something that works.
And is this what you mean by the term next generation psychedelics? Because I know you mentioned that in the book as well.
Well, next generation psychedelics, it kind of gets back to what some of those companies are doing in terms of intellectual property. They're looking for psychedelics that don't require a big trip. They're looking for psychedelics that maybe, I don't know, can reduce your anxiety or depression and not require an 8 hour or 10 hour trip with two or three guides and all of the overhead that would come with a long trip with lots of guides. So they want a pill mill kind of model. They want this kind of model where you just take it, You pop it at lunch, and your anxiety goes down. And we looked at some of the developments in that regard, and that's when I think the pharmaceutical industry will jump in more fully if they can develop a pill mill approach to psychedelics. Then the pharmaceutical industry will just kind of gobble the space up.
And patented new compounds. Yeah, they're interested in that as well.
Mm-hmm.
I would just say, just maybe add, there are some instances where next generation psychedelics may be useful. I'm thinking of there are several, but I'm thinking of ibogaine, some ibogaine derivatives that may offer similar anti-addictive properties, but uh, don't have the cardiovascular risks that ibogaine does, and ibogaine does have significant cardiovascular risks. So there are some potential benefits, but why are these companies developing this whole swath of new molecules when existing molecules show a lot of promise? Why aren't they expanding on the successes maybe of existing compounds? That in itself is highly suspect. It suggests it is really about patents and intellectual property and riches than more than it is patient outcomes, generally speaking. And some companies have their sights set super high. The CEO of Inveric Biosciences, he's talked about how the company's patent applications might cover 100 million new molecules in the future. Right. So that's ridiculous, right? But it gives you a sense of the mentality in the next generation psychedelic space.
Mm-hmm. And I want to talk a bit more about this idea in Western medicine that disorder is an individualistic thing, sort of gets back to like the neoliberalist ideas of it. So, why is that problematic to be locating mental illness in an individual rather than these broader factors?
In our society, huge numbers of people have been convinced or persuaded that their discontent or their unhappiness, their suffering is a result of chemical imbalances or biomedical abnormalities, deficient brain chemistries, all this kind of stuff, right? And that you need a medical intervention, usually in the form of a pill you take every day. Well, that conclusion's been sharply criticized in recent years, but it remains the dominant one. One of the questions we ask in the book is, what about social causation? What proportion of diagnosed conditions can be related to things like precarious employment, unaffordable housing, inequality, financial insecurity, right? Or what are the psychological impacts of millions of people believing that they just suck because they can't keep their heads above water in a system that's structurally rigged against them? I don't think we take these questions at all seriously enough. Depression, anxiety, problematic substance use can be seen as predictable reactions to those kinds of structural problems, but our pharma dominated system rejects the possibility of social causation. Um, okay, well, along comes psychedelics. I mean, what are they going to be? Are they going to be an extension of this? Um, basic health care, affordable housing, a job that pays somewhat decently is probably going to be more effective for most depressed people than any psychedelic drug trip. So we should recognize that right off the bat. And if we don't, psychedelic medicine, I don't know, is it just going to become like the rest of big pharma, kind of maintenance therapies that help people largely, help people get out of bed in the morning and cope with their structural disadvantages, tools of the corporate wellness industry? We hope not, right? That would be pretty unfortunate. That's all it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kevin gave a thumbs up.
Good enough, yeah. Okay, good.
Your book also highlights concerns around the appropriation of indigenous knowledge and public domain substances, like we've been talking about. So, how can those issues be addressed when we do live in this Western capitalist society? How can we balance the respect for indigenous traditions and also have those efforts to expand access through Western medicalization?
Yeah, just as a first thing, the medical set and setting that is being established for the psychedelic renaissance, I mean, it just kind of paves over centuries and centuries of indigenous ceremony, indigenous knowledge in this realm, and a totally different way of understanding oneself in relation to community and the natural world. And that is part of those approaches to engaging with, plant teachers, entheogens. They're different terms because it's a different set and setting. And when we just jump full on into a medical model without providing access to certain kinds of other spaces where indigenous approaches and underground approaches are allowed, in fact, they might be criminalized in this medical set and setting, then we are doing a real disservice to ourselves, and it's another form of violence against indigenous communities.
Jamie, did you have anything to add there?
No, that's perfect.
Okay. Um, my next question gets into what you mentioned about surveillance. So, how might mainstreaming psychedelics expand different drug war or surveillance infrastructure? And what are digital psychedelia surveillance technologies that you mentioned in the book?
Kevin's
Yeah,
good at
so
this stuff. Yeah.
the mainstreaming of psychedelics is going to come with some new laws, and these laws are going to say, these particular psychedelics are legal now, and they're legal in these spaces, medical spaces mostly, or you can use psychedelics in a kind of retreat center somewhere where it's sanctioned and people have had certain kind of certification, and all of the other kinds of substances that are out there are still going to be subject to the same schedule of drug law that we have in Canada and the United States. It's not going to undermine the drug war at all. In fact, it could intensify it. You could see when maybe people are trying to provide access to psilocybin or other substances in underground spaces or in non-sanctioned spaces, they're going to get raided. They're going to get taken down by police. Police need the drug war to be sustained as an institution. And so we're a little bit afraid that this current tendency towards medicalization and the laws that sanction psychedelic use in medical spaces are going to leave everybody else behind. They're going to leave behind folks who maybe want access to psychedelics in other spaces, underground shamanic spaces, and they're going to leave behind other people who use drugs that are not so-called good psychedelic drugs. Like, what about people who are street involved, experiencing poverty and racism, and they use other drugs? What kind of developments do we have to help those people? We're criminalizing them, and we're criminalizing harm reduction. Like right now, there's a big case in Canada against the folks who were involved in the Drug User Liberation Front, that, like, basically suggesting that they're involved in illegal distribution of drugs, and they've countered with a charter challenge saying, it's against the security of the person to not provide safe supply. So this is where the debate is headed. It has to be about a broader approach to safe access for everyone who uses drugs, not just niche, high echelon, expensive access to psychedelics for rich people.
Yeah, and turning towards sort of those future alternatives, Jamie, did you want to jump in with something?
Well, just to follow up on something Kevin said, yeah, I mean, medicalization in the absence of decriminalization. I mean, that's the likely scenario, at least right now, in most of North America, and it's very problematic. And in addition to all the reasons Kevin gave, you know, that really does lend support to what we see as false dichotomies between what qualifies as medicines on the one hand and drugs on the other, right? And this false dichotomy has been going on for a long time in history. But one of the things this could lead to, we think, is something called bifurcated scheduling, where a drug product is placed in a different schedule than the active ingredient or substance. So if the FDA in the United States were to approve psilocybin for depression, what would change? What would be rescheduled? Well, likely only FDA approved psilocybin products, like maybe Compass Pathways. They have a proprietary formulation called Comp 360, and they've already patented it, and now they want to sell it and be the only game in town. Well, that's likely what's going to happen. That's going to be rescheduled. That's going to be legalized. Well, psilocybin itself will remain a Schedule 1 drug and prosecuted as a restricted narcotic for everybody else. Right? I mean, we haven't seen that much yet, but I think that's likely to happen. So, yeah, I mean, not only can medicalization help to, as Kevin alluded to, help to sustain the drug war, but even give it new targets for surveillance and prosecution. We've already seen psilocybin arrests in the United States going up, peyote arrests, ayahuasca, ingredients, people arrested all over the world. This is all increasing. So, medicalization, while potentially helpful to a subset of the population, might not be very helpful to everybody else.
Yeah, it's a good point. And what can we sort of do about that? I mean, looking to the future, what are some models that you see as promising to sort of make this more just and equitable?
Well, that's a good question, and that's an important question. In the book, we do look at the Oregon model and the Colorado model, and there's some pluses and there's some minuses with those models. There's some access that is not simply medical access, but there's still a lot of restrictions. There's still some ways that corporate capture could happen there. We look at the work of a lot of important advocacy groups. So there's Therapsil in Canada that's launching different kinds of challenges to create access for end-of-life care, just like the basic things that the government could do in terms of providing access to alleviate really crushing anxiety at the end of life. The government makes it really hard to get access currently, and it should be pretty easy. And I think we'd like to see more advocacy, and we'd also like to see the models and the advocacy groups that are out there embrace a broader critique of the drug war and think about the other folks who are left behind, with the majority of the focus being on a medical approach.
Yeah, I would just add, we're also, as you could probably tell if you read the book, big proponents of decriminalization. It's starting to happen. You can see it in cities across the United States. There's been quite a few of them now that have decriminalized, partially decriminalized, psilocybin and other plant-based psychedelics. A few states in the United States have started to do that as well, but it's been pretty limited so far. But ultimately, I mean, we believe that ideally community-controlled decriminalization and harm reduction models offer much better avenue of mainstreaming psychedelics. If that's going to happen, then and challenging the war on drugs at the same time, than relying on these kind of piecemeal approaches that grant limited medicinal access to particular psychedelics under particular conditions for particular conditions. It's not necessarily, again, it may help a subset, but it's not necessarily something to be widely celebrated. And we don't limit our focus to psychedelics either when we talk about decriminalization, right? Decriminalization that focuses only on psychedelics it has its place, but as Kevin alluded to earlier, it leaves aside a huge swath of the population who are using so-called bad drugs or hard drugs, and their continued marginalization and criminalization. So I mean, decriminalizing all drugs and treating drug use and dependency as a public health issue would go a long way towards alleviating some of the tragedies of the drug war, and it's something we'd like to see moving forward at some point. Right?
Yeah, and we're coming up on my last question now. So, without the psychedelic exceptionalism aspect of it, how could psychedelics be used responsibly as tools for broader social change?
Maybe I'll just mention something quick before I turn it over to Kevin. We did talk about politics a little bit before, and how we felt compelled to push back against some of the more crazy political claims made by some advocates in the space, like psychedelics are going to save the world in various ways. That's untrue and unhelpful. But at the same time, it would be a mistake to dismiss the political potential entirely. As I mentioned, psychedelics have played a role in social movements in the past, a big role, in fact. And the literature shows that they can have, as I mentioned too, I think transformative impacts on individuals, including political impacts. Increased empathy, for example, increased openness to experience. Literature shows that, which is generally associated with more liberal or progressive values. A greater appreciation for nature, a greater desire to protect nature, nature relatedness. So, this kind of stuff. And in the right context, the right set and setting, psychedelics can help people to get motivated to participate in movements and even challenge systems directly. This is especially the case in certain contexts, democratic, participatory, community-based context, as opposed to corporatized and medicalized contexts. That could really open up possibilities for this kind of engagement. So yeah, it's a point we make in the book. They can be seen as tools, right? Tools for broader social change, but the material political reality on the ground needs to be conducive to foster that kind of potential. They really go hand in hand. So psychedelics aren't going to do it for us, but they could contribute if we, in the right context, the right set and setting.
Awesome. Well, thumbs up from Kevin again. So,
Oh, I get the last word? Oh, that's unusual for us, actually.
oh yeah. Thank you both for joining me. This was awesome, and I'm excited to share this conversation with our listeners. So I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Elaine. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Of course. Thank you so much for tuning into this conversation with Kevin Walby and Jamie Brownlee. I'd like to thank the Center for Psychedelics, Health and Research at Queen's University and the support of our sponsors at the Ontario Brain Institute, the Canadian Biomarker Integration Network in Depression, and Providence Care Hospital. Until next time, be well and integrate wisely.